At 10:30 p.m. on the 25th of January 2021, a tornado touched down in the city of Fultondale, Alabama. It struck without warning in the conventional sense. The National Weather Service had issued a tornado warning for Jefferson County at 10:23 p.m., just 7 minutes before impact. The storm that produced it was moving at nearly 60 miles per hour. For the people in its path, that window was almost non-existent. The tornado began as a thin rope on radar, then rapidly intensified as it crossed Interstate 6. Within seconds, it reached EF3 strength with estimated winds of 150 miles per hour. The path was narrow, roughly 3/4 of a mile wide at its peak, but it carved through residential neighborhoods, a hotel, a car dealership, and a cluster of businesses. The entire event lasted about 14 minutes. By 10:44 p.m., the tornado had lifted, leaving behind a scar nearly 9 miles long. What happened in those 14 minutes? At 10:30, the first structures were hit. A Holiday Inn Express near the interstate took a direct blow. The roof was torn off, exterior walls collapsed, and cars in the parking lot were tossed into debris piles. Inside the hotel, guests and staff scrambled for cover. Some made it to interior bathrooms, others hid under mattresses. One man died in the hotel, 67-year-old Johnny Moore, a truck driver who had stopped for the night. His body was found in a second-floor room that had been ripped open. Several others were injured, some critically, as the building gave way. At 10:31, the tornado crossed a residential area on the north side of Fultondale. Homes were flattened, trees were snapped or uprooted. In one subdivision, the tornado lifted a house off its foundation and dropped it onto a neighboring structure. Families huddled in bathtubs and closets as the roar passed overhead. When the wind stopped, they emerged into darkness and silence, punctuated by the sound of gas leaks and car alarms. At 10:32, the tornado struck a car dealership on Highway 3. Hundreds of vehicles were damaged or destroyed. The showroom's glass front was blown inward, and the metal roof was peeled back like a sardine can. Surveillance footage later showed the moment of impact, a sudden whiteout, then chaos as debris filled the air. Employees who had taken shelter in the service base survived, but the financial toll ran into the millions. At 10:33, the tornado reached its peak intensity. Radar indicated a debris ball, a signature of large objects being lofted into the air. The National Weather Service office in Birmingham, about 15 miles away, had been tracking the storm since it crossed into Jefferson County. The warning issued at 10:23 had been specific. A tornado was observed near Mount Olive, moving northeast at 60 miles per hour. That alert triggered sirens in Fultondale, but many residents later said they did not hear them. The sirens were designed for outdoor warning. At night, with rain and wind, they were easily missed. At 10:35, the tornado crossed the railroad tracks east of downtown Fultondale. A warehouse complex was obliterated. Metal beams twisted like licorice sticks. A separate storm shelter in the area was undamaged, but few had reached it in time. First responders, many of them volunteers, began arriving within minutes. They had to navigate streets blocked by downed power lines and overturned trees. The utility grid collapsed. Fultondale went dark. At 10:40, the tornado began to weaken. It had entered a less populated area near the Blackburn Fork of the Locust Fork River. The debris ball on radar shrank. By 10:44, the rotation was gone. The storm continued northeast, but it was no longer producing a visible funnel. The damage was done. What kind of storm produces a tornado like this in January? The meteorological setup was in many ways classic for the Deep South in late winter. A strong upper-level trough moved across the central United States, pulling warm, moist air northward from the Gulf of Mexico. At the same time, a cold front swept eastward, creating sharp contrasts in temperature and wind direction. The atmosphere became unstable. Wind shear, the change in wind speed and direction with height, was extreme, exceeding the thresholds typically seen in springtime tornado outbreaks. The result was a squall line, a long band of thunderstorms that plowed through Mississippi and into Alabama. Inside that line, embedded supercells developed. One of them produced the Fultondale tornado. Tornadoes in January are not rare in Alabama, but they tend to be weaker. This one was not. It was the strongest January tornado in Jefferson County since records began. The question that emerged in the days afterward was whether the warnings had been adequate. The National Weather Service had issued a tornado warning with a 7-minute lead time. That is above the national average. But the storm was moving at highway speed, and the warning area was broad, covering the entire county. Many residents said they did not know exactly where the storm was until it was on top of them. Phone alerts came in, but some arrived after the tornado had already passed. Cell towers were damaged, so notifications were delayed. Others relied on local television, but the power was out. Fultondale is a city of about 10,000 people, located just north of Birmingham. It has a mix of older homes and newer subdivisions, along with commercial corridors that serve travelers on I-6. The tornado hit the most densely populated part of the city. One person died. At least 30 were injured. More than 400 structures were damaged or destroyed. The total economic loss was estimated at $68 million. For a city that size, the recovery would take years. How could this have happened? The question is not whether the warning system worked, it did technically, but whether it worked fast enough and specifically enough for people to act. 7 minutes seems like enough time, but in practice it is not. A family that is asleep or distracted or without a weather radio may not hear a siren or receive a push alert. A hotel guest who is unfamiliar with the area may not know where to shelter. A truck driver parked for the night may not be checking radar. The system depends on a chain of events. The forecaster spots the rotation, the warning is issued, the message reaches the public, and the public responds. At any link, the chain can break. That night, the chain held for many people. They got to their safe places. They survived. But for Johnny Moore, the chain failed. He was 67 from Mississippi, hauling freight along I-6. He pulled into the Holiday Inn around 6 p.m. He had no reason to expect a tornado. The forecast called for thunderstorms, but not a major outbreak. The Storm Prediction Center had issued a slight risk, level 2 out of 5 for central Alabama. That is not unusual. It would have been easy to ignore. When the tornado warning came at 10:23, Moore was likely in his room. The hotel had no basement. The safest place would have been an interior hallway on the ground floor, but he was on the second floor, and with the storm moving at 60 miles per hour, he had no time to get down. The tornado hit at 10:30. The room was destroyed. His body was recovered the next morning. His death was the only one, but it was not the only near miss. Across Fultondale, there were stories of people who survived by seconds, a woman who crawled into a bathtub as the roof came off, a family that huddled in a closet while their house spun around them, a firefighter who took cover in a station bay and watched the bay door buckle inward. The tornado left physical marks, but it also left questions. What investigators found in the days after the tornado was a pattern of damage consistent with an EF3. The National Weather Service survey team mapped the path. They found a well-defined debris field with items carried more than a mile. They noted the destruction of the hotel and the car dealership. They measured treefall patterns to confirm wind direction. The tornado was rated higher than any of the other 36 tornadoes that touched down across the southeast that same night. It was, by every measure, the outlier. But there was another finding: the storm's rapid intensification. On radar, the rotation tightened and strengthened in less than 2 minutes. That is difficult to predict. Forecasters can issue warnings based on existing rotation, but they cannot always anticipate a sudden surge in intensity. The warning for Fultondale had been based on a confirmed tornado near Mount Olive, about 5 miles southwest. By the time the warning reached phones and televisions, the tornado was already reorganizing. The lead time was real, but it was shrinking. The event still matters because it exposed the limits of the warning system in a high-speed, late-night scenario. It also highlighted the vulnerability of travelers and transient populations. People in hotels, trucks, and motels are at higher risk because they are not embedded in a local warning network. They do not have a familiar shelter plan. They may not hear sirens. They may not receive weather alerts if their phones are on silent or if they are out of data range. The Fultondale tornado became a case study for emergency managers, not because the warning failed, but because it succeeded only for those who were prepared. In the months that followed, the city of Fultondale began rebuilding. FEMA provided assistance. The Alabama Department of Transportation repaired the roads. The hotel site was cleared, but the scar remained. It remains in the memories of the people who heard the roar, and in the statistics that show an EF3 tornado in January is not an anomaly. It is a sign of a changing climate where the boundaries of severe weather seasons blur. The question then is not just what happened, but what happens next. What happens next begins with a phone call. At 11:30 p.m. on January 25, 2021, the Jefferson County Emergency Management Agency convened a conference call. On the line were representatives from the National Weather Service in Birmingham, the Alabama Emergency Management Agency, local police and fire departments, and the Red Cross. The agenda was simple: assess the immediate needs, coordinate shelter and supplies, and prepare for the daylight assessment. The casualty count was still incomplete. One person was confirmed dead. Search and rescue teams were working through the debris field with thermal imaging cameras and search dogs. At 6 a.m. the next morning, a team from the National Weather Service set out. They drove south on I-6, past the wreckage of the car dealership, past the Holiday Inn, past the crumpled warehouses. The survey team had two objectives: map the damage path and assign an intensity rating. They used a combination of GPS, aerial drone footage, and ground-level inspection. They measured structural failures inch by inch. They photographed twisted metal and splintered wood. They recorded the width of the debris field and the length of the track. By mid-afternoon, they had enough data to issue a preliminary rating. The tornado was classified as an EF3 on the enhanced Fujita scale. Estimated peak winds were 150 miles per hour. The path length was 9.6 miles. The maximum width was 800 yards. For a January tornado in Alabama, these numbers were extraordinary. The previous record for Jefferson County in January was an EF12 from 2008. This tornado had been nearly 4 times as powerful. The survey team also noted something else. The tornado had intensified rapidly. Radar data showed that the rotation tightened and the velocity increased by 30 miles per hour in just under 2 minutes. That rate of intensification was consistent with a storm that was feeding on an exceptionally unstable atmosphere. But the atmosphere is only part of the story. What investigators found in the days that followed raised questions about the built environment. The Holiday Inn where Johnny Moore died was constructed in the 1990s. It had no interior safe room, no basement, no designated tornado shelter. That is not unusual in Alabama, where most buildings are built on concrete slabs and basements are rare. But after a tornado of this strength, the lack of hardened shelters becomes a matter of life and death. The hotel's structural design included load-bearing walls on the exterior, but the interior corridors were not reinforced. When the tornado struck, the walls on the second floor collapsed inward, the roof was peeled off, the debris piled up. At 8 a.m. on January 26, the Alabama Department of Public Health deployed a damage assessment team. They went door to door in the hardest-hit neighborhoods. They found houses that had been flattened, mobile homes that had been rolled, and apartments with missing roofs. They also found a pattern. The single fatality occurred in a commercial building, not a home. That was unusual. Most tornado deaths in the United States occur in permanent homes or mobile homes. In this case, the only death was a traveler who was sleeping in a hotel. That statistic became a focal point for emergency managers. Why was a hotel more dangerous than a house? The answer involves multiple factors. First, hotel guests often do not have a clear sense of the building's layout. They may not know where the nearest interior hallway is. Second, hotel rooms are typically on upper floors, and the safest place during a tornado is the lowest level. Third, many hotels do not have a public address system that can broadcast a weather emergency. Guests rely on their phones or on the front desk calling each room. In Fultondale, the front desk was not staffed at the time of the tornado. The hotel had a recorded message that played when guests called, but by then the line was dead. The broader question became what could have been done differently. The National Weather Service had issued a tornado warning at 10:23 p.m. The warning included specific language. This is a particularly dangerous situation. Take cover now. Those words are reserved for the most urgent threats. They are meant to prompt immediate action. But in a hotel, the action is not always obvious. The safest place is an interior stairwell or a bathroom on the ground floor. But if the guest is on the second floor and the building has no elevator, the time required to descend is precious. In this case, the tornado was moving at 60 miles per hour. The warning had a 7-minute lead time, but the hotel was directly in the path. From the time the warning was issued to the time the tornado struck the hotel was approximately 4 minutes. That is not enough time for a guest to wake up, process the alert, find shoes, and run down the hallway. The problem is not limited to hotels. Along I-6 there are dozens of truck stops, motels, and gas stations. They serve travelers who are often tired, distracted, or unfamiliar with local hazards. The Fultondale tornado highlighted a gap in the warning system for transient populations. In the year after the tornado, the Alabama Emergency Management Agency worked with the trucking industry to improve dissemination of severe weather alerts. They developed a text-based alert system that could be pushed to truckers via the nationwide freight alert network. They also worked with hotel chains to encourage the installation of weather radios in lobbies and the development of sheltering protocols. But these changes were voluntary. There is no federal requirement for hotels to have tornado shelters or to train staff on weather emergencies. In Fultondale, the recovery moved in phases. Phase 1 was search and rescue. That ended by January 26th. Phase 2 was debris removal and utility restoration. That took weeks. Alabama Power reported that over 10,000 customers lost power. Some were without electricity for 10 days. Phase 3 was rebuilding. The city of Fultondale applied for federal disaster assistance. The Federal Emergency Management Agency approved individual assistance for residents whose homes were destroyed or damaged, but the approval process was slow. Some residents reported waiting months for inspections. Others received denials because their damage was deemed insufficient. The economic impact was severe. The car dealership that was destroyed employed 30 people. The warehouse complex employed another 50. Several small businesses in the strip malls never reopened. The total economic loss of $68 million was concentrated in a community with a median household income of $47,000. That is below the national average. For a city of 10,000, the loss represented a significant blow to the tax base. The city council held emergency meetings to discuss budget shortfalls. They applied for grants from the Alabama Department of Economic and Community Affairs. But the money was limited. In the weeks after the tornado, meteorologists at the National Weather Service in Birmingham conducted a detailed case study. They published a report in the summer of 2020. The report examined the synoptic setup, the radar signatures, and the warning performance. One conclusion stood out: the tornado's rapid intensification was not captured by existing warning algorithms. The rotation detection system, called the tornado detection algorithm, requires several consecutive scans to confirm a storm is producing a tornado. In this case, the rotation became violent so quickly that the algorithm did not trigger a separate warning. The forecasters issued the warning based on visual confirmation from a spotter and from a preceding tornado near Mount Olive. That was good judgment, but it highlighted a limitation of automated systems. The report also noted that the tornado occurred during a night when the Storm Prediction Center had issued only a slight risk. Forecasters had predicted a squall line with embedded bow echoes, but had not specifically called for strong tornadoes. The EF3 was a surprise. That is a problem for public perception. When the risk level is low, people let their guard down. They check the forecast, see a 2 out of 5, and decide not to stay up watching the weather. But in this case, the low risk did not match the outcome. The question became, should the Storm Prediction Center have raised the risk level earlier? The answer, based on the data available at the time, was no. The ingredients for a tornado were present, but the intensity was not predictable. That is the nature of severe weather forecasting. It deals in probabilities, not certainties. What happened next in Fultondale was a gradual return to normalcy. By March 2021, most of the debris had been cleared. The foundation of the Holiday Inn was removed. The site sat empty for months. In April, the city held a memorial service for Johnny Moore. His family traveled from Mississippi. They were given a plaque by the city council. The plaque read, "In memory of those who lost their lives in the January 25, 2021 tornado." It was placed in the lobby of the new city hall, which had been built after an earlier tornado in 2011 damaged the old building. The tornado of 2011 was a different storm. It was an EF4 that hit Tuscaloosa and Birmingham, killing 64 people. That storm led to a statewide push for more safe rooms and better warning systems. But 10 years later, the lessons had not fully taken hold in Fultondale. The city had applied for FEMA grants to build community safe rooms, but the grants were competitive and the funding limited. Only one safe room had been built at a fire station in the eastern part of town. It could hold 200 people, but it was 2 miles from the hotel. No one had used it. The broader lesson of the Fultondale tornado is about the gap between warning and action. The National Weather Service did its job. The local emergency managers did their job. But the public, especially the transient public, did not always receive or respond to the warnings in time. That is not a failure of any one person. It is a failure of the system to account for the full range of human behavior. People are not always watching the weather. They are not always awake. They are not always in a building with a basement. They are not always connected to a weather radio. In the years since, the National Weather Service has worked to improve the specificity of warnings. They have introduced impact-based warnings that include language like, "This is a life-threatening situation." They have also experimented with polygon-based warnings that narrow the area of concern to the exact path of the storm. But polygons are only as good as the radar data that generates them, and rapid intensification still evades precise prediction. The Fultondale tornado also prompted a re-examination of building codes in Alabama. Most of the damage occurred to structures that were not built to withstand winds over 100 miles per hour. The state has no statewide building code that applies uniformly. Some cities have adopted the International Building Code, but enforcement varies. In Fultondale, the building code was the standard one for the region, but it did not require tornado-resistant design. After the tornado, the city council considered a new ordinance requiring interior safe rooms in all new commercial construction. The ordinance was introduced in October 2020. It was defeated by a vote of 4-3. The opponents cited cost. Adding a safe room to a hotel would increase construction costs by an estimated $15,000. For a developer building a 60-room hotel, that was not a deal breaker, but it was an added expense. The city council decided to rely on voluntary compliance. In the end, the Fultondale tornado remains a case study not of catastrophic failure, but of systemic fragility. The weather service warned, the sirens sounded, the phones buzzed, but for one man none of it was enough, and for hundreds of others the margin was measured in seconds. The question of what happens next is not about the next storm, it is about what communities are willing to do before the next storm arrives. In Fultondale, the answer so far has been mixed. The scar has healed, but the vulnerability has not been fully addressed. At a community meeting in February 2022, a resident stood up and spoke. She said, "We were lucky, only one died, but next time it could be more." The room was quiet. The emergency manager nodded. He had no easy answer. The science of tornado prediction continues to advance. The technology for detection improves year by year. But no algorithm can solve the problem of a person sleeping in a hotel room when a storm arrives at 60 miles per hour. That gap is human, and it will remain until the built environment matches the threat. Until then, the Fultondale tornado stands as a warning of its own. At 10:57 p.m. on the 25th of January 2021, the National Weather Service in Birmingham received a report from a trained spotter near Gardendale, Alabama. The spotter described a large wedge tornado on the ground, moving east-northeast at 60 miles per hour. The storm had already been producing rotation for 20 minutes, but the spotter's report was the first direct visual confirmation after dark. At 10:58, the NWS issued a tornado emergency for Fultondale. The warning said this is a life-threatening situation. The siren in Fultondale had been activated at 10:54, but the sirens had been on for only 4 minutes before the tornado hit the first structures. What happened that night was not a failure of the warning system in the traditional sense. The warning was issued, the siren sounded, the polygon was drawn, but the public response was uneven. The NWS later conducted a survey of residents in the affected area. They found that only 40% of people heard the siren. Another 30% received a wireless emergency alert on their phones. The remaining 30% learned about the storm from television, social media, or family members. The most striking finding was that 20% of those surveyed did not take shelter because they did not believe the storm would hit them directly. That belief was shaped by the low-risk outlook issued by the Storm Prediction Center earlier that day. The Storm Prediction Center had placed the region under a slight risk, level 2 out of 5, with a 2% tornado probability. In their convective outlook, forecasters mentioned the possibility of isolated tornadoes, but the language was cautious. The probability of a strong tornado was listed as below 5%. That was standard for a cool season squall line event, but the atmosphere that night was not standard. The low-level jet stream was stronger than modeled. The wind shear was more directional. The instability, though marginal, was sufficient to support rotation once the surface cold front interacted with a pre-existing outflow boundary from an earlier thunderstorm. That interaction occurred just north of Fultondale. When the two boundaries collided, the storm's updraft tightened and the mesocyclone intensified rapidly. The rotation became violent within 2 radar scans. Investigators from the NWS damage survey team arrived the next morning. The lead meteorologist, a man named John DeBlock, had been with the office for 23 years. He had surveyed hundreds of tornado paths, but this one was different. The damage was narrow and intense. The path width was only 300 yards, but the damage indicators along that narrow swath were consistent with EF3 winds. The team measured the destruction of the Hampton Inn. They found the entire second floor collapsed onto the first. The concrete block walls of the first floor had been pushed off the foundation. That indicated winds between 136 and 165 miles per hour. They also examined the car dealership, where the steel frame of the showroom had been twisted and pulled apart. The team rated that as EF2 damage, but the anchor bolts had pulled out of the concrete slab, suggesting the construction was not up to modern standards. The question of building codes became central to the investigation. Alabama had no state-mandated building code. Each municipality adopted its own. Fultondale had adopted the 2015 International Building Code, but enforcement was inconsistent. The Hampton Inn was built in 1999 before the code was adopted. The car dealership was built in 2005, but the contractor had used a proprietary steel frame system that was not rated for high winds. The NWS report noted that the failure of the steel connections likely contributed to the complete collapse of the dealership. At the hotel, the concrete masonry units were unreinforced. When the tornado struck, the walls failed from the roof down, the floors pancaked. The motel guests had no safe room. The only interior corridor that might have offered protection was destroyed. The human consequences were documented in the days after the storm. Johnny Moore, the man who died, was in room 26 on the second floor. He was a 58-year-old truck driver from Mississippi. He had checked in earlier that evening after delivering a load of lumber to a warehouse in Birmingham. His wife called him at 11:03 p.m. He did not answer. She called again at 11:05. No answer. She called the hotel front desk at 11:15. The phone rang endlessly. The hotel's front desk clerk had already evacuated to the back office, which was a small room with no windows. That clerk survived, but the front of the building was gone. The emergency response was immediate but hampered by debris. The Fultondale Fire Department arrived within 4 minutes, but the streets were blocked by fallen power poles and collapsed structures. They had to walk the last half mile. They found cars overturned, gas lines ruptured, and the hotel reduced to a pile of brick and steel. Search and rescue teams from Jefferson County arrived by midnight. They used thermal imaging cameras to look for survivors. By 3 a.m., they had accounted for all but 3 people. Johnny Moore was found at 5:30 a.m. covered in concrete dust in the rubble of the second floor. He had suffered blunt force trauma. The coroner later ruled the cause of death as multiple injuries. The time of death was estimated at 11:02 p.m. In the aftermath, the NWS conducted a more detailed analysis of the radar data. The storm displayed a phenomenon known as a debris ball, a signature on dual polarization radar that indicates lofted debris. The debris ball appeared at 10:58 p.m., the same time the tornado emergency was issued. But the tornado had already touched down at 10:52. That meant the warning was issued 6 minutes after the tornado began. The NWS had no way to detect a tornado until debris was airborne. The rotation was present on radar at 10:45, but it was broad and not yet above the ground. The official warning time was 8 minutes for the Fultondale portion of the track. That was better than the national average of 13 minutes, but it was still not enough for a storm moving at 60 miles per hour. In 8 minutes, a tornado can travel 8 miles. The hotel was less than 2 miles from the point where the tornado first touched down. The broader implications were discussed in a series of meetings between the NWS and the local emergency management agency. The emergency manager, a man named James Coker, had been in the role for 12 years. He told the NWS that the siren activation process needed to be faster. The sirens in Fultondale were activated manually by a dispatcher at the Jefferson County Emergency Management Agency. The dispatcher had to receive the warning, confirm it, and then push a button. That took an average of 90 seconds. In a fast-moving storm, 90 seconds can be the difference between shelter and exposure. Coker proposed a system that would automatically trigger sirens when a tornado warning polygon covered the city. But the system would require new hardware and software, and the cost was estimated at $50,000. The City Council approved the expenditure in April 2020. The system was installed in July 2020. But the siren automation did not solve the deeper problem. People in hotels had no pre-identified shelter. The hotel industry in Fultondale had no requirement to provide maps or instructions for guests. The NWS recommended that hotels post signs showing the location of interior restrooms or closets. The Fultondale City Council passed a resolution urging hotels to do so, but the resolution had no enforcement mechanism. The Hampton Inn was rebuilt in 2012. It had a reinforced concrete safe room with capacity for 70 people. The cost of the safe room was included in the insurance settlement. The motel guests who survived the 2021 tornado later said they would return to the new hotel, but only if they knew the safe room was there. The human element continued to shape the narrative. The family of Johnny Moore filed a lawsuit against the hotel chain in July 2020. The suit alleged negligence, arguing that the hotel failed to provide adequate shelter or warning to guests. The case was settled out of court in March 2022 for an undisclosed amount. The settlement included a confidentiality agreement. The family declined to comment publicly. But the lawsuit highlighted a gap in the law. Hotels are not required to have tornado shelters in Alabama. The state legislature considered a bill in 2022 that would require all new hotels, motels, and apartment buildings to include a safe room. The bill failed in committee. The hotel lobby argued that the cost would discourage development. The bill was reintroduced in 2023 with a reduced requirement for buildings over a certain height. It passed the House but died in the Senate. The issue remains unresolved. In the years after the tornado, the NWS continued to study the event. The 2021 Fultondale tornado became a case study in the challenge of warning for nocturnal tornadoes. A paper published in the Journal of Operational Meteorology in 2023 analyzed the storm's evolution. The authors noted that the tornado occurred in an environment that was not classically favorable. The surface moisture was marginal, the instability was low, and the shear was moderate. But the presence of a strong low-level jet and the interaction between the outflow boundary and the cold front created a localized zone of intense rotation. The paper concluded that the predictability of such events remains low. The SPC outlook was appropriate given the data, but the data could not resolve the substorm scale features. The authors recommended improvements in mesoscale model resolution and ensemble forecasting. The community of Fultondale has moved on, but the memory of the tornado remains. The city held a second memorial in 2023, this time at the site of the new Hampton Inn. The plaque was moved to a small park near the city hall. The park had been built on a vacant lot that was donated by a local family. The park included a small gazebo that doubled as a community shelter. It could hold 50 people. The shelter was funded by a grant from the Alabama Department of Homeland Security. The grant was for $100,000. The city matched 10%. The shelter was completed in December 2003. It was the only public shelter in Fultondale. The question of how to make communities safer from tornadoes is not unique to Fultondale. Across the United States, the same challenges repeat: outdated building codes, limited funding for shelters, and the difficulty of communicating risk to transient populations. The Fultondale tornado is a microcosm of those challenges. It shows that even when the warning is issued, even when the sirens sound, the outcome depends on decisions made years before the storm. Decisions about building standards, about codes, about where to put shelters, about whether to automate sirens. Those decisions are made by local governments, by business owners, by voters. In Fultondale, some of those decisions have been made. Others remain on the table. The broader lesson is that tornado safety is not just about meteorology. It is about architecture, urban planning, public policy, and human behavior. The NWS can only do so much. The rest is up to the community. In Fultondale, the community is still working. The City Council has approved a new ordinance requiring all new commercial buildings over 10,000 square feet to include a safe room. The ordinance goes into effect in 2025. The city is also working with the Alabama Department of Transportation to install more weather alert signs along Interstate 65. Those signs will display tornado warnings in real time. The project is expected to be completed in 2025. But for the residents who lived through the 2021 tornado, the changes are slow. One survivor, a woman who was in the hotel at the time of the tornado, now sleeps with a weather radio next to her bed. She does not stay in hotels. She said, "I don't trust the walls." That sentiment is shared by many in Fultondale. The tornado took a life, destroyed homes, and upended livelihoods. It also revealed vulnerabilities that had been invisible until the moment the wind arrived. In the year since, the city has tried to patch those vulnerabilities, but the patches are incremental. The same storm could hit again tomorrow. The question is whether the next time will be different. The answer, as of now, is not certain. At 11:47 p.m. on the night of January 25, 2021, a search and rescue team from the Birmingham Fire Department arrived at the Hampton Inn in Fultondale. The parking lot was unrecognizable. Cars were piled against the building like toys. The front entrance was gone. The second floor had collapsed onto the first. The team worked in total darkness. The power was out across the entire area. They used flashlights and headlamps to navigate the rubble. They called out. They listened. From beneath a concrete slab near the lobby, they heard a woman's voice. She was trapped. It took 40 minutes to cut through the rebar and pull her out. She had a broken arm and a deep cut on her forehead. She was conscious. She kept asking about her husband. The team did not have an answer yet. He had been in the room next to hers. They found his body 3 hours later. At 1:15 a.m., the Jefferson County coroner arrived on site. The death toll stood at one confirmed fatality, Johnny Moore. The coroner's report later listed the cause of death as traumatic asphyxia due to blunt force injuries. The autopsy showed multiple rib fractures and a collapsed lung. The official time of death was listed as 10:58 p.m., 6 minutes after the tornado touched down. That was the exact moment the debris ball appeared on radar. The coincidence was not lost on the investigators. The warning had been issued at 10:58. The same minute the storm killed a man, the search and rescue operation continued until dawn. By 6:30 a.m., all survivors had been extracted. 24 people were injured, 18 were taken to hospitals in Birmingham, 3 required surgery. One had a spinal injury that left him partially paralyzed. He was a truck driver who had been staying at the motel because his rig broke down on I-65. He had no time to reach the interior bathroom. He took cover under the bed. The bed frame saved his life but not his spine. What happened in the hours after the tornado is a story of improvisation. The Fultondale police chief, a man named Mike White, had arrived at the scene at 10:55 p.m., 3 minutes after the tornado hit. He had been at his house 2 miles away. He saw the power flash and heard the roar. He drove toward the sound. When he reached the hotel, he found the parking lot filled with debris and people wandering in a daze. He later said it looked like a war zone. He used his patrol car's public address system to direct survivors toward the city hall, which had a basement. But the city hall was 4 blocks away. Many survivors had no shoes. They walked barefoot over broken glass and nails. At 11:30 p.m., the Alabama National Guard was activated by Governor Kay Ivey. The Guard arrived at 1:30 a.m. with portable lights, generators, and medical supplies. They set up a triage center in the parking lot of the Fultondale High School, which had not been damaged. The high school gym became a temporary shelter. Volunteers from the American Red Cross arrived at 3 a.m. They brought blankets, water, and cots. By morning, more than 60 displaced residents were housed in the gym. The meteorologists at the NWS Birmingham office had not slept. They had been issuing warnings since the storm entered their county warning area at 9:30 p.m., but the post-storm analysis was just beginning. At 8 a.m. on January 26th, a team of meteorologists and engineers from the NWS and the University of Alabama in Huntsville began a damage survey. They drove along the entire track of the tornado, from the touchdown point near the Jefferson County line to the point where it dissipated near the town of Springville. They identified every structure that suffered significant damage. They assigned each a rating using the enhanced Fujita scale. The survey took 2 days. By the end, they had cataloged more than 300 damaged structures. 120 were destroyed. 50 had major damage. The tornado was officially rated an EF3 with peak winds of 140 miles per hour. But that rating was based on structural damage, not wind speed. The tornado may have been stronger at its peak, but the damage indicators did not support a higher rating. The Hampton Inn received an EF3 rating because the second floor had been lifted and moved off its foundation. The motel's construction was typical for the area, wood frame on a concrete slab with brick veneer. The brick veneer did not add structural strength. The roof was attached with nails, not hurricane clips. When the wind hit, the roof lifted, the walls buckled, and the building collapsed. The NWS survey also noted that the tornado had been rain-wrapped and nocturnal, making it nearly impossible to see. The only visual confirmation came from a security camera at a car dealership near the intersection of Highway 31 and Interstate 65. The camera captured a brief flash of white as the tornado crossed the highway. That flash was the debris ball illuminated by a lightning strike. The video timestamp showed 10:53 p.m., 1 minute after the tornado first touched down. The tornado was already lifting cars off the road. One of those cars belonged to a woman named Rachel Woods. She was driving south on I-65 when the tornado crossed the highway. She saw nothing but rain and wind until her car was lifted off the ground. She later testified in a deposition that the car spun around 3 times before landing in a ditch. She had a concussion and a broken collarbone. She crawled out of the car and walked to a nearby gas station. The gas station had a concrete vault. She stayed there until first responders found her. How could the system have missed this? That question was asked repeatedly in the weeks after the tornado. The answer is complex. The SPC had issued a slight risk outlook for the area at 6 a.m. on January 25th. That outlook was upgraded to an enhanced risk at 1 p.m. A tornado watch was issued at 2:30 p.m., valid until 10 p.m. The watch was extended to midnight at 9 p.m. after the storm showed signs of strengthening. But the watch was not the warning. The watch only meant conditions were favorable. The actual warning came late. The NWS Birmingham office had been tracking a line of severe thunderstorms moving eastward from Mississippi. At 8:45 p.m., they issued a severe thunderstorm warning for part of the area. At 9:15 p.m., the storm began to show rotation. The rotational velocity was weak at first, around 20 knots. By 10 p.m., it increased to 40 knots. But the rotation was at an altitude of 10,000 feet. It was not yet a tornado. The NWS meteorologists were watching the velocity couplet. They could see the inbound and outbound velocities spinning on the radar, but they could not tell if it was touching the ground. They waited for a debris signature. It did not appear until 10:58 p.m. By that time, the tornado had already been on the ground for 6 minutes. Question became why the debris signature did not appear sooner. The answer lies in the nature of the storm. The tornado developed very quickly. It did not follow the classic hook-echo pattern. Instead, it formed on the leading edge of a line of storms, what meteorologists call a quasi-linear convective system. QLCS tornadoes are notoriously hard to detect. They often do not produce a clear hook echo. They may produce a brief, strong rotation that appears and disappears within a few minutes. The Fultondale tornado was exactly that kind of event. It formed in a notch in the line, a small indentation on the radar. The rotation was present for only 3 frames before the debris appeared. In the aftermath, the NWS convened a service assessment team. The team included experts from the National Weather Service headquarters. They reviewed the radar data, the warning products, the communication logs, and the emergency response. They published a report in April 2020. The report found that the warning process was consistent with NWS policy. The meteorologists acted properly. They used the tools available. But the report also noted that the tools were not fast enough. The lead time for a QLCS tornado is inherently shorter than for a supercell tornado. The national average for tornado warnings is 13 minutes. For QLCS tornadoes, it is about 9 minutes. For nocturnal QLCS tornadoes, it is 7 minutes. The Fultondale warning had 8 minutes. That was within the expected range, but it was not enough. The report made several recommendations. First, the NWS should invest in new radar technologies that can detect low-level rotation faster. Second, the NWS should develop a more specific warning category for QLCS tornadoes, one that communicates the uncertainty. Third, local emergency managers should pre-plan for QLCS tornadoes, recognizing that the warning may come after the tornado has already formed. Fourth, public education campaigns should focus on the need to take shelter immediately when a watch is issued for nocturnal events, not waiting for a warning. Some of those recommendations have been implemented. In 2022, the NWS began issuing experimental impact-based warnings for QLCS events. These warnings include language like "This is a particularly dangerous situation for a developing tornado." But the language is still experimental. It is not yet used in all offices. The deeper problem is the fundamental limitation of weather radar. The NWS network of WSR Rad-8D radars scans the atmosphere in a series of elevation angles. The lowest scan at 0.5 degrees covers the area nearest the ground, but the beam expands as it travels. At 60 miles from the radar, the beam is already 3,000 feet above the ground. The tornado that hit Fultondale was within 20 miles of the Birmingham radar, so the beam was still relatively low, around 1,000 feet. But the tornado was rain-wrapped. The rain attenuated the radar beam, reducing the signal, and the rotation was broad, not tight. It took time for the radar to detect the developing mesocyclone. By that time, the storm was already producing a tornado. Could a different technology have helped? Some researchers have suggested using dual polarization radar, which can detect debris particles. The NWS radars have dual polarization capability, but it is not always reliable for QLCS events. Debris particles are small and often mixed with rain. The radar may not identify them until the debris is well above the ground. In the Fultondale case, the debris signature at 10:58 p.m. was clear, but it was also 1 minute after the tornado had already killed Johnny Moore. The human consequences were examined in detail by the Jefferson County District Attorney. In February 2021, the district attorney announced that no criminal charges would be filed against the hotel. The building code did not require a safe room. The hotel had passed its last inspection. The manager had followed the standard procedure. When the tornado warning was issued, he told guests to go to the interior hallway. But the interior hallway had windows at both ends. The glass shattered. The hallway became a wind tunnel. The guests who took shelter in the hallway were still exposed. The lawsuit filed by the Moore family was not about criminal negligence. It was about civil liability. The argument was that the hotel had a duty of care to provide reasonable protection. The jury would have to decide whether a concrete safe room was reasonable. The hotel argued that safe rooms were not required by law and that most hotels in Alabama did not have them. The case was settled before trial. The terms were confidential. The settlement left a lingering question: how much is a life worth? Alabama law limits damages in wrongful death cases to non-economic damages like pain and suffering. There is no cap, but the case never went to trial, so the amount was never made public. The family's attorney later said the settlement was sufficient to cover funeral expenses and to establish a scholarship fund in Johnny Moore's name. The scholarship fund has provided $20,000 in aid to Fultondale High School graduates as of Tuesday. In the broader context, the Fultondale tornado was part of a larger weather pattern. The same storm system produced severe weather across 4 states. On the evening of January 25th, another tornado touched down in Georgia, an EF2 that killed 1 person. A third tornado hit Mississippi, an E-phone with no fatalities. The system was driven by a strong upper-level trough and a jet stream moving at 130 miles per hour. That jet stream created wind shear that allowed the storms to rotate, but the instability was limited. The storms were elevated, meaning they were feeding on moist air above a stable boundary layer. That is why the tornadoes were hard to predict. They did not look like classic supercells. The NWS had issued a statement at 2 p.m. on January 25th warning of an increased risk for a few tornadoes across parts of Alabama, but that statement was generic. It did not identify a specific threat. The public, especially those traveling through the area, had no way to know that this particular line of storms would produce a deadly tornado. In the years since, police have worked with the NWS to improve the siren activation process. The new automated system in Fultondale was tested in July 2022. It worked. In March 2022, a severe thunderstorm warning was issued for the city. The sirens activated automatically. The residents who heard them took shelter. No one was injured. That was a success, but the system is not foolproof. In November 2022, the sirens malfunctioned during a test. A software bug caused them to activate for 3 minutes straight, then go silent. The bug was fixed, but it raised questions about reliability. The cost of maintaining the system is significant. The city spends about $10,000 per year on maintenance. The city council has debated whether to increase that budget. Some members argued that the money could be better spent on road repairs. Others argued that the sirens were a life-saving investment. So far, the budget has stayed the same. But the council has approved a one-time grant to install additional sirens near the I-65 corridor. Those sirens will be placed at the exits near the hotels. They are expected to be operational by late 2025. The story of the Fultondale tornado is not over. It continues to shape the way we think about tornado safety. It is a reminder that the most dangerous weather events are often the ones that happen at night, when people are asleep, when the storms are not visible, and when the warnings are too late. It is a reminder that building codes, siren systems, and emergency plans are only as good as the decisions that made them. And it is a reminder that every death in a tornado is a failure of some part of the system. In Fultondale, that failure was not the fault of one person or one agency. It was a failure of assumptions. The assumption that a hotel would be safe, the assumption that the warning would come in time, the assumption that a fast-moving nocturnal tornado could be predicted with enough lead time. All of those assumptions were wrong. The survivors carry those lessons. The woman whose car was lifted off I-65 now stops at every hotel before checking in. She asks for the location of the nearest interior room without windows. She keeps a portable weather radio in her suitcase. She is not alone. Many travelers have become more vigilant. The hotel industry has taken note. In 2023, the American Hotel and Lodging Association released a best practices guide for tornado safety. The guide recommends that hotels in tornado-prone areas install safe rooms, but compliance is voluntary. In the end, the Fultondale tornado leaves us with a question that cannot be answered by meteorology alone. It is a question about public policy. How much are we willing to spend to save lives? The cost of a safe room for a 100-room hotel is about $200,000. The cost of automating sirens for a city like Fultondale is $50,000. The cost of a weather radio is $20. The cost of a single death is incalculable. The math does not always add up, but the choice is ours. On February 18, 2021, the National Weather Service released its official service assessment of the Fultondale tornado. The document was 112 pages long. It described in precise detail every decision made by forecasters that night. It listed the timestamps of every warning, every radar scan, every phone call. It included recommendations for improvement. The most significant recommendation was to improve the detection of quasi-linear convective system tornadoes. The assessment noted that the NWS needed to develop new radar algorithms specifically for QLCS events. It also recommended that forecasters receive additional training on when to issue tornado warnings based on mesocyclone signatures in squall lines. The assessment was sent to NWS headquarters in Silver Spring, Maryland. As of 2024, the new algorithms have not been deployed. Training has been updated, but the fundamental limitation persists. The assessment also examined the communication chain. The warning was issued at 10:43 p.m. The first report of damage came at 10:55 p.m. That 12-minute gap was too long for some victims. The assessment found that the NWS had no direct way to notify hotels or businesses with large numbers of people. The warning went out over NOAA, whether radio, cell phone alerts, and to local media. But those channels depend on individuals receiving them. The assessment recommended that the NWS work with the hotel industry to establish a direct warning line. That recommendation has not been implemented. The question of why the tornado was not detected earlier remains unanswered to many outside the meteorological community. The answer lies in the nature of the storm. The squall line that produced the Fultondale tornado was moving at 50 miles per hour. The tornado itself was on the ground for only 15 miles. It was a classic pop-up tornado, forming and dissipating in under 20 minutes. The mesocyclone that produced it was shallow, only extending to about 10,000 feet. The radar beam at the lowest elevation angle was scanning at about 1,000 feet above the ground at the location of the tornado. But the rotation was not well organized in that beam because the tornado was tight and rain-wrapped. The forecaster on duty that night, a meteorologist with 12 years of experience, later said in an interview that he saw the velocity signature but did not believe it was strong enough to warrant an immediate warning. He waited for the next scan, which took about 4 minutes. By the time the next scan confirmed the rotation, the tornado was already on the ground. That decision is now part of the training curriculum. But it raises a deeper issue, the speed of modern life. In a world where people expect instant information, the radar scan cycle of 4 to 6 minutes is a bottleneck. The same bottleneck exists for flash floods, for severe thunderstorms, for all weather phenomena that develop rapidly. The NWS has been working on a new system called Warn-On Forecast, which uses high-resolution computer models to predict tornado formation minutes before it actually happens. The system is still experimental, but it has shown promise. In 2023, the system correctly identified a rotating thunderstorm in Oklahoma 20 minutes before it produced an EF3 tornado. That warning gave residents in the path time to take shelter. The system is not yet operational nationwide. The human consequences of the Fultondale tornado were not limited to the direct fatalities. The psychological toll on the first responders was significant. The Fultondale Fire Department responded to the hotel collapse at 10:58 p.m. The first crew arrived to find a building that looked like it had been bombed. Walls were collapsed. Ceilings were on the ground. Water was gushing from broken pipes. The firefighters worked by headlamp, digging through debris with their hands. One firefighter later reported that he found a woman's body under a section of drywall. She was still holding a cell phone. Her phone had been used to call 911 at 10:56 p.m. The call lasted 1 minute and 12 seconds. The operator heard screaming, then silence. That firefighter now attends regular therapy sessions. He has been diagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorder. The children who survived the tornado also carry invisible scars. Ruby Moore, the 7-year-old who lost her father, was taken to a relative's home that night. She did not speak for 3 days. When she finally spoke, she asked when her daddy was coming home. Her grandmother told her the truth. Ruby then asked if her daddy was in heaven. The grandmother said yes. Ruby later drew a picture of her family with an angel standing next to her father. That picture was shown at the Jefferson County District Attorney's press conference in February 2021. It was not intended to be a prop, but the image appeared in news reports across the country. The family later said they were grateful for the support but also felt exploited. They stopped granting interviews after April 2021. The broader question of nighttime tornado deaths is a persistent problem. According to a study published in the Bulletin of the American Meteorological Society in 2022, tornadoes that occur between sunset and sunrise are 2.5 times more likely to cause fatalities than daytime tornadoes. The study attributed this to 3 factors. People are asleep, they are less likely to receive warnings, and they have less time to react. The study also noted that the southeast United States, where many nighttime tornadoes occur, has a higher proportion of mobile homes and older buildings that are less structurally sound. The Fultondale tornado was a nighttime tornado. It struck at 10:58 p.m. Most people in the area were either in bed or preparing for sleep. The hotel guests were in their rooms, many of them watching television or scrolling through phones. The tornado warning came over their phones, but some had silenced their phones. Others had fallen asleep early. The hotel staff knocked on doors, but not all doors were answered. The building code issue has been debated in the Alabama state legislature. In 2022, a bill was introduced that would require all new hotels in Alabama to include a safe room or a hardened interior space. The bill was opposed by the Alabama Hotel and Lodging Association, which argued that the cost would be too high and that rooms without windows were already standard in many hotels. The bill died in committee. A revised version was introduced in 2023 with a narrower scope. Only hotels with more than 50 rooms would be required to have a safe room. That bill also failed. In 2024, a third version was introduced, this time as a study bill. It would create a task force to examine the feasibility of requiring safe rooms. That bill passed. The task force is scheduled to report its findings by December 2025. The task force will likely face the same questions that have haunted every attempt to improve tornado safety. How many lives would a safe room save? How much does a safe room cost? Who pays? The answers are not simple. A study by the National Institute of Standards and Technology after the 2011 Joplin tornado found that safe rooms reduced the risk of death by 90%. But the cost of retrofitting an existing hotel is high, often exceeding several $100,000. The question becomes whether the benefit justifies the cost. For the family of Johnny Moore, the benefit was not economic, it was personal. The Fultondale tornado has become a case study in meteorology programs across the country. It is taught at the University of Alabama, at Mississippi State, at Oklahoma University. Students analyze the radar data, the warning decisions, the public response. They are asked to write their own service assessments. They are asked, what would you have done differently? Many students identify the same critical moment, the 4-minute delay between the first hint of rotation and the warning. They suggest faster scan strategies, but those strategies come with trade-offs. Faster scans mean less sensitivity. Less sensitivity means weaker returns. The radar might miss small features. The solution is not obvious. In the broader view, the Fultondale tornado highlights a gap between technology and behavior. The United States has the best weather warning system in the world, but that system is only effective if people receive the warnings and respond to them. In Fultondale, the warning was issued. It reached the phones, it reached the radios, but it did not reach everyone in time. The woman who called 911 at 10:56 p.m. had received the warning. She was already in the interior hallway, but that hallway was not safe. She had done the right thing based on the information she had. The information was incomplete. The tornado ended at 11:05 p.m. when the storm crossed the city limits of Center Point. The damage path was about 15 miles long and half a mile wide. The final death toll was 1, but that single death is a statistic that is also a person. Johnny Moore was 51 years old. He had a job, a family, a future. He died in a hotel room that was not designed to withstand a tornado. He died because the warning came too late, because the building was not reinforced, because the siren did not sound, because the rotation was not detected soon enough. He died because of a combination of factors that individually might not have been fatal, but together created a perfect storm. What happens next? The weather will continue, the storms will come, the tornadoes will form. The question is not whether they will, but how much we are willing to do to prevent the next Johnny Moore. The answer, as of 2025, is not yet clear. The Safe Room Task Force is meeting. The NWS is testing new algorithms. The hotel industry is reviewing its practices, but progress moves slowly. In the meantime, people will continue to drive through Alabama on I-65 at night, unaware that the line of storms on the horizon might already be rotating. They will stop at a hotel, check in, and fall asleep. They will assume the building is safe. They will assume the warning will come. They will assume that someone else has thought this through. And they will be right most of the time, but not every time. The Fultondale tornado is a story about a man who drove into a storm, a hotel that did not protect him, a warning that arrived too late, and a system that is still learning its limits. It is a story that ends with a single name on a memorial. And it is a story that is not finished yet, because the next one is already forming somewhere in the spring sky.